Hi everyone, it's James here, and in today's tutorial we're going to be building this custom JavaScript audio player. So as you can see, the audio player consists of two parts. We've got this playlist on the left hand side, which allows us to select any of the audio files that we've loaded into our player and have the ability to play them and also to pause them too. And the second part of our audio player is this visualization element. So when we actually resume some audio, you can see the visualization picks up the audio input and continues to generate these bars. But when we pause the audio again, the visualization stops until we select another audio item. So let's dive in and start coding up our custom JavaScript audio player. So the completed project code is available on GitHub, and I'll put a link in the description below. And if you clone that to your local computer and then just switch straight away to the setup branch, you'll see we'll get a blank HTML page to start working with, and we've got some necessary setup files that we can start working with to start coding up our JavaScript audio player. So I've called it an audio player because it could literally be anything. It could be songs or podcast items or interviews. Any category of audio file that you can think of could be used for this purpose, and if you're coding up your own version of this custom audio player, you might want to name it appropriately depending on what type of application it's for. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a new JavaScript file called audioplayer.js, and this is going to hold a class which will be used to load in our audio elements. And when I was coding this up initially, I thought it'd be really good if our audio player actually created all of the HTML markup for us. So in our index.html file in our web page, all we need to do is put a placeholder of where we want our audio player to load, and the JavaScript will do all of the rest of the work for us. So let's start creating this class now. We'll say export a default class, and we'll call it audio player, and we'll want a constructor in here which basically is going to take a couple of bits of information. And the first thing is we're going to take a parameter in called selector, which is going to be the placeholder element which will be used to generate all of the other HTML elements on top of that. And we'll also want to pass in a list of audio files as well, which I'm just going to default to an empty array for the moment. So I'm going to set some member properties of this class so that we can use them elsewhere in other functions. So the first thing I want to do is just get a reference to where the player element is actually sitting on the page. So we'll do that with a query selector, and we'll just use the selector variable that's been passed into the constructor. And the other thing we're going to do is create a member property that holds a list of those audio files. And we also want to have something called the current audio. So this will be the current item that's playing, and we'll just default that to null to start off with. And then we just want to call a function, which I haven't created yet, called create player elements. And this will create all of the necessary HTML markup for our player. So we can start work on that now. So let's say create player elements. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a HTML5 audio element and save it onto the class as well, so we can reference it elsewhere. So this will be used to actually control and play the actual audio on the page. So the next thing I want to do is create a playlist elements, which will hold all of the audio items that are going to be played or be playable in our audio player. And that's just going to be a div element there. And I'm going to append one class to that, which will we'll set up some styling in just a moment. So we'll just say it's the class is playlist. So then I'm just going to apply these two elements to our page to start off with. So on the player element, I'm just going to append first of all the audio element. So that'll be this.audio lem, and then also we want to append on the playlist too. So let's actually test that out so you can see what we're trying to achieve here. So in our app.js, that's our main application file here. Let's just import a audio player from audio player, and I think that's actually in the wrong place. So let's move that into our source folder here. And that should work for us now. And I'm just going to save a reference to that by creating a new audio player object, and I'll leave the defaults as they are for the moment. And then the only thing we need to put into our actual index page is that root element where the audio player is going to load. So that was just the selector that we used was just a class of audio player. So if we have a look in our web page now and take a look at the elements that we've got on the page, you can see there's a HTML5 audio element there and a playlist element as well, which is just an empty div at the moment and nothing appearing on the page, so we need to add something into there. But you can see our JavaScript is loading and it's generating those basic elements for us at the moment. So let's go back to our audio player, and part of the player elements as well is the actual links to the songs that we want to get them to play. So I'm just going to, inside here, call another function, and we'll call it create playlist elements, and we'll pass in the playlist element as well, so we've got a reference to that. We could do this all in this one function here, but let's just separate it out so it makes it a bit easier to read. And let's call create playlist elements, which will have our playlist lm being passed in. And so what we want to do here for each of the audio files that are being passed into our audio player object is we actually want to create an entry into our playlist. So we'll remember we saved all of our audio files onto a property called this.audio. So we can loop through each of those, and for each of those what we will do is I will create a new item to actually append to our playlist. And I'm actually going to use an anchor tag for this, and there's a good reason for that which you'll see in a moment. And I will set the href of that anchor tag to basically each audio item that's been passed in. It'll actually be an object, so we'll reference its URL from there, because we also want the title on the audio element as well. So what we'll say is in our audio item, we'll set the inner HTML, so this is inside of the anchor tag, and I'm going to be using font awesome for our icons, so we'll say FA play and close that off, and the text that we want to display is going to be the audio.name. So again, each of these audio items in this array will be an object, and it'll have two properties, URL and name. And then so for each of those, we'll say playlist lm.append child and the audio item. So if we run that, we won't see any difference in our markup because we haven't actually passed any into our audio object at the moment. So in the repository, there are some songs. So this is where you want to load in the audio items that you want your own audio player to actually use. So let's go to our app.js, and this time, instead of just accepting the defaults from the constructor, we'll pass in the audio player CSS selector, and then we need to pass in an array. And as I mentioned, each one will have a URL, so it'll be songs, and then for example we've got night driver.mp3, and also the name, which we'll just call night driver. So I'm just going to do that for the other songs that we've got in our folder there. So now we're actually passing an array of audio files into our audio player class. And if we have a look back in our page, you can see that now there's some links to playing those particular items from our basic markup. And what we can actually do here is if we actually click on one of those now, it will actually take us to the HTML5 audio player, and that will just load and play the song for us. So this is quite good for using the anchor tag will achieve this for us, and it just means that if JavaScript isn't running on a particular page where the user is trying to play your audio from, it will default to the default behavior there. So now you can see our markup is looking a little bit like this. We've got the playlist with all the list of songs, but what we want to do is actually instead of going directly to the MP3 file and playing it with the HTML5 audio player, we want to load the particular audio file into this audio element and then trigger a playback from there. So this is a little bit tricky because we need to keep a track of what item is actually playing at any one time, and then we need to check if the current item is playing and then decide whether or not we need to pause it or if we need to start it playing again from scratch. So for each of those audio items, I'm actually going to set up an event listener for it. So set up event listener audio item, and this will just be a click event which will trigger, but let's create a new class for that. So audio item. So for the audio item, we're going to add an event listener, and that will be the click event listener. And inside that, the first thing we'll do is just stop the navigation from happening, as you saw a moment ago, which we'll do with prevent default on the event object that's passed into the callback. And then I'm going to set up a little local variable here just called isCurrentAudio, which is basically going to be true or false. Is this item that's just been clicked the current audio item that is either playing or is currently paused. So the way I'll do that is say the audio item will get its attribute or its href attribute. So this is the item that's currently being clicked, and we'll just check, is that equal to the current audio dot get attribute dot href. So this should just return as true or false depending on whether the current audio item that's been clicked is the same as the current audio item that's playing. And we'll just put a bit of defensive code in here. Just to say if the current audio variable on the class is actually null, we won't try and get its attribute, because otherwise this will throw an error in our JavaScript code. So this is the tricky part where we want to check if an item is actually paused or playing. So what we'll say is if we're actually looking at the current audio element and the audio element on the page, which is the actual HTML5 audio element, is not paused, then we need to pause it. So what we're going to do first of all is call a function saying set the play icon for this.currentAudio, and this.audio element, we're going to actually pause that. What's this set play icon function here? Well, let's create that now so we understand what we're doing there. So set play icon. So this is basically going to accept any type of element, I'll just say lm. And if you remember up here, what we did is in each of the audio items, in each of those anchor tags, we included inside there an I tag that has the icon for playing. So what we're going to do is just fiddle around with these classes here to add the pause icon and remove the play one for pausing, and also the opposite for setting it as a play icon. So I'll first of all get a reference to that icon from our element, and I'll just use a query selector on that to get the I tag. Make sure we assign it there. And for that icon, all we're going to do, if we're setting a play icon, what we need to do is actually make sure that the pause icon isn't there. So remove FA pause, pause if it's there. And also on the class list, we need to add FA play. And just while we're here, we'll do the other function that we need as well, which is to set the pause icon. And as you can see, it's exactly opposite. We're going to add a pause class and remove the play class if it's there. So we need to make an extension to our if statement here because we've got some other scenarios to deal with. So if we're still looking at the current audio item and the audio element, the HTML5 audio element is actually paused, we want to enable the pause icon for the current audio element. And also we want to set the audio element playing. So this might seem a bit backwards, but if you think about the logic here, if the audio item is actually playing, we actually want to pause the playback of the audio, and then we want to change the icon to a play icon, which is the next state of the audio when you actually click that button. And then the same thing here, if the audio is already paused, we want to play the audio, and then we want to show the pause icon, so that is the next action that will happen when you click the item in the playlist. So the final scenario is if we're not looking at the current audio that's been actually just clicked in this event. So what we're going to do then is set the current audio equal to the audio item. And with that done, we want to set the pause icon as well for this. And so we'll pass in the current audio here because that's to be the same. And then we're going to update the source of our HTML5 audio element, which is going to be what is used to play our audio for us. And we'll do that by first of all getting the current audio, and on its attribute list we should be able to get its href, which will be the URL of the audio that we want to play, and then on the audio element finally we can actually play it. So that's the tricky bit over. If you're not too worried about pausing items and resuming them, then you could probably skip some of this and remove some of this logic here. And so if we go back to our page now, we should be able to click any of the items in our playlist and they should start to play. And then if we click another one, oh, we have got an error come up there. Let's have a look at what that is from our code, saying something about the attributes. Oh yeah, I think we made a little bit of a mistake there. So attribute, that should be there, okay. So let's try that out again. If we click one of the items in the array, that should play for us, and clicking it again will cause it to pause, and if we click it again, it should resume playing. And then, yeah, we can go to other items in our playlist as well and click those too. Okay, and we should see in our audio player playlist, there should be some classes available on the icon that we've loaded into the anchor tag. So if we just click on that first night driver one, you can see it's changing to pause, change it back to play, pause, play, and that seems to be controlling the audio element quite nicely and loading in the correct audio file each time we click on the relevant link. So that's the basic functionality of the playlist. We're creating our elements. We've got the click event set up for when we click on one of those items. Probably the best thing to do next is to set up some styling because it's not looking that great at the moment. So let's go straight ahead to our Sass file. And the first thing I'm going to do is just import a bit of a better font. I've just picked one out from Google Fonts. And I will also load in the Font Awesome icons from the node module, so they're included in the package already. So as long as you've done an npm install when you're setting this up, they should be available for you there. So straight away we've got our icons and a slightly better font. And the next thing, before we start moving on to styling the actual player itself, let's just position it centrally on the page. You don't have to do this obviously, depending on where it's going to end up in your particular usage. But let's just do that just so we can see it a bit better whilst we're working on it. So, sorry, display flex center, and we'll just justify the content center as well. So this is really where it comes down to you, depending on how you want the actual playlist and audio player to look. I'm just going to put in some styles here for our example, but I'll leave it down to you to come up with your own customizations here. And especially if you're building on a particular site as well, you might want to customize it to how that site looks and feels. So I'm just going to add a very simple box shadow here, just lift it off the page a little bit. And we actually need to load in that font family, which I didn't do before, so the font isn't being used yet. So Source Sans Pro and default to a sans serif font. So there we go, that's font's now being used. And we're just going to set a static width on this of 600 pixels, and I'm going to display everything as flex again. So we're going to have a canvas element in here, which we haven't added in yet, but I'm just going to set up the styling whilst we're here so that that's ready to go for us. And this will be the canvas that's used to display the visualiser. That's the graphic bars that we're dancing around at the start of the tutorial. So that's there ready to go. But the main thing we want to really style is our playlist. So what I'm going to do for this is just use a linear gradient. So what I did for the application is just go over to cssgradient.io and just copy and paste a very simple dark background from here. And so let's paste that into our playlist background. And I also have in our image folder just a simple textured background, which I'm just going to load in on top of our gradient just to give a bit of texture. And again, this is something that you can customize for your liking. And inside our playlist, so we want a column of our playlist items. So I'm going to say it's flex, and the flex direction is column. And we're dealing with anchor tags here, which will have a padding. So I'll say top and bottom 0.75 and left and right 2.5 rems. I'm going to say display flex again, simply because the icon font, the I tag, could do with centering as well. Make sure it's taking up 100% of the width that's available there. And I'll just set the color as white for the text. Oops. There we go. And because they're links, we will probably want to remove that text decoration as well. So say none. So let's just add a little bit of formatting for the icon tag as well. So we'll say the font size, just make that a little bit smaller than it needs to be. and we'll put a bit of margin right on it as well. So there's a little bit of space between the text as well. And the final thing I'm going to do for the anchor tag, let's just put it up here, is to add a hover event. So when you actually hover over one of those anchors, we will set the background color to white and the text color to black. So let's have a look at that now. So here you can see we've got all of our anchor tags available, and they've got their hover effect and also the icons as well. So let's just test out the icon switching as well. So when the first item is playing, that changes to a pause icon, and clicking it again changes it back to play. And let's try another one, and then that goes to pause. Let's try switching between the two. Oh, that's not working that well. I think we need to remove that icon before we switch the current audio item. So let's go back and change that in the JavaScript code. And what we'll probably want to do as well is, because the current audio item will be null to start off with before we've actually set an item playing. So let's just check if there is actually a current audio item selected on our class. We'll only trigger that play icon if that's the case. So let's go back and have a look. So if we play this bottom one here, playing and pausing works okay. So let's select this top one now, and you can see the bottom item that was previously selected is no longer showing as being able to be paused. So what we're going to do now is start working on this visualization part of our custom audio player. And I'm going to be honest, I found this article on MDM, and it shows you sort of a step-by-step way of creating either an oscilloscope or a frequency bar graph for working with audio. So I'll put a link to this in the description below, but I'm going to take you through how I use this tutorial to actually set up the visualization that you saw in the demo project before. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our setup where we create our player elements, because we haven't actually got a canvas loaded in there yet. So let's create a new canvas element, and I will do that up here. I'll say we'll need to get a reference to the visualiser element, and that's just going to be a canvas, as I say. Oops, canvas. And we'll also append that onto the player root element itself as well. So that's all we need to do to get the canvas loaded on, and we styled it with a black color to start off with, so you can see that's being loaded in there now, so that's all ready for us to use. And the other thing we're going to need on our class is an audio context, and this is something which will hold a reference to the audio that we're working with. I'm going to set that to null to start off with, because there is a little bit of a caveat in browsers where you can't start working with this audio context until the user has actually clicked on a button. And the idea being is this will stop auto playing of files. So websites can't do that annoying thing of automatic playing audio when you start visiting the page. So what we're going to do is, on our audio player class, we're going to create a new function called create visualiser. And in here, we're going to set the audio context to a new audio context object. We're going to do a couple of things here. We're going to set a new source variable up, and it'll be part of the audio context. We're going to call a function on that called create media element source. And we're going to pass in the audio element, which, if you remember, is the actual HTML5 audio tag that we've loaded into the page. Next, we create something called an analyzer, which is coming from our audio context again. And there is a function we can call on there called create analyzer. And I'm going to get a local reference to our canvas, which is called on a class member called visualiser LM. Next, we need to get the context of the canvas, which, if you've worked with canvas before, is a standard step when you want to start drawing things onto a canvas. So we'll say get context 2D. Then next, we connect the source to the analyzer, and the analyzer gets connected to the audio context destination. So these connect commands, you can think of connecting the audio that's been played through the audio element into the analyzer so that we can actually get the data out of it. Then we need to set the FFT size of the analyzer, which is basically the number of samples that have been taken from the data. So analyzer FFT size, and I'm going to set it to 128. And then finally we set up a few variables with regards to the actual data that's coming from the analyzer. So we first of all want to get the buffer length. Which we can then create a new unsigned array from. So we'll say the data array is equal to a new unsigned int array of buffer length. And from that data we can actually calculate how wide each of the bars are going to be. So we'll say the bar width is basically equal to the size of the canvas width, but divide it by the buffer length, multiplied by 2.5. So the final step in our visualizer is to actually create the animation that displays all of the bars and then changes it on a frame by frame basis. So we're going to set up a function inside of our create visualizer method, and we'll call it render frame, for example. And we're going to use the request animation frame function to make sure that this gets rendered on each animation repaint in the browser. So we're going to create a local variable inside here called bar, which will represent each individual bar as we're going through the items in our data array. And what we want to do at each frame redraw, we'll want to call a special function on the analyzer called getByteFrequencyData, and we'll pass that the data array object that we created, which means our data array will get populated with the information from the analyzer, and we can work out how high we want to draw our particular bar at each frequency range. So the first thing we'll do is for our context, which is our canvas, we're just going to fill it with a black color. So we do that by setting our fill style and then doing a fill rect, starting at the bottom corner and then going for the entire width and the entire height of the canvas. So with our canvas cleared, we're going to loop through our data array by creating a local variable I, and then we'll keep iterating until we've reached the buffer length that we set in the previous part of the code. And from that we can calculate the bar height. So we'll access that data array at the individual positions. And what you might want to do here is just remove a little bit of the height from it, because what I've found from playing around with this is that the data that comes in from this data array, the bars are actually too high and they're just at the top of the screen all the time. So if you just remove a certain amount from it, you can play around with this figure, but I found 75 seems to work okay. And we'll just generate a bit of a random color as well. So we're going to generate a random red value. So based on the bar height, and we'll say it's the bar height plus 25 and times a fraction of the buffer length, depending on what position we are in our for loop. So what this will do is just generate a bit of a random value depending on the bar height between 0 and 255, which we can then use in our fill style. So speaking of which, let's actually go back to our context for the canvas, and we'll set our fill style equal to RGB, and then we'll use that R value that we just created, and 150 for green and blue. And again, this is something that you can play around with to get some different colors and different feels on the frequency bars. And then again on our context, what we'll do is we'll fill a rectangle. So this will be for each individual bar. So we'll say start at position bar, which initially will just be 0. And we want to set the Y position to the canvas height minus the actual bar height itself. And we've got already stored a variable that has our bar width, and we just then pass in our bar height. So this line alone will just generate one bar on its own, but because we're in a for loop, that will obviously generate all of the bars for our data array. But one thing we'll just want to do is make sure that our bar, this is our X position for our bar, is incremented on each pass of the for loop by the bar width amount. And we can put a little bit of padding around the bars as well, just by adding a couple of pixels value here. If you left this off, all the bars would be right next to each other, which is fine. You can have a play around with this setting as well. So that in a nutshell is the function that will render the visualization for us. And you can see it will be called every time the browser can get an animation frame, but we just need to kick that off when the create visualizer function is actually called. So before we actually finish this function off, we'll just say render frame. So in order to use this create visualizer function, we can't just put it in our constructor or anywhere else in our code. What we actually need to do is trigger it on a click, Because as I mentioned before, the browser will actually block it because it'll think that you're trying to autoplay some audio without any user intervention. So one way around this, rather than having a button that you need to actually click to get the animation and the audio context to actually work, in our setup event listener functions, what we could do here is when we receive a click event, we could just do a quick check here to say if the audio context has not been set, which it won't be on initial construction because we set it to null initially. If it's not set, then what we can do is create the visualizer here. And because this will then set the audio context, this won't run again, which will likely cause problems with duplicate audio contexts. So let's save that and let's actually go back to the page now. So let's try clicking one of the items in our playlist. Oops, and we've got some errors going on there, quite a few errors going on. So bar height's not defined, so let's see what's going on there. Okay, so I forgot to initialize bar height in here. We can just set it as a const because it will be reset on each part of this for loop. So let's save that. Let's go back again. Let's try that. And you can see now the audio is playing and we've got our visualization going on there as well. And if we click the button to pause the audio item, the visualization stops obviously. And if we pick another one, it carries on there and they've got a different visualization. So that visualization seems to be working okay. As mentioned, you can customize this quite a lot depending on your needs. If we set the sample size up here to 256, for example, and just save that, you'll notice we get a lot of smaller bars, and that's because the sample size has been set more, so you can customize that depending on how much detail you want on that visualization. That looks pretty cool. That looks quite good actually with the smaller bars as well there. And we can also play around with the colors as well. So for example, if you wanted to go for a more of a blue look, we could say set the blue value of our RGB fill style there to 255. And now when we play, you can see that that's quite dramatically changed the color of the bars in the frequency graph too. So that pretty much completes our JavaScript custom audio player. As I say, there's some things in there that you can customize, and the playlist itself has got a lot of scope for putting your own mark on it. And you could really make it fit into whatever website or web app you're using this in. And hopefully you've seen it's quite easy and quite useful in your JavaScript code to create all these elements yourself, rather than putting all of the markup into the HTML. And we've also seen how request animation frame can call a function over and over again and help us to redraw our canvas element. So that's it for this tutorial. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and so you don't miss out on any future tutorial updates. And I'll see you in the next lesson.